Hi, I'm Colleen Campbell. I'm a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and host of Faith and Culture. Today I'm in San Antonio to talk with author Barbara Elliott about faith-based groups that are renewing the heart of America's cities. Please stay tuned. What exactly it is and who you serve through the center.
It's an organization that I founded in Houston in 1997. The idea is to serve the people who are on the front lines in our cities throughout America by coming alongside those that are street saints out doing the Lord's work, and to help them in doing it better and connecting them to resources, giving them models for ministry, and essentially serving as their advocate and spokesman.
Now, how did you
wanted me to do? And if you ever really pray about that honestly and mean it, look out, because
dangerous
you're about to
question, right?
You never know where you're going to get sent. The answer to that prayer came in a single word: refugees. It was the summer of 1989, and it was just before the Berlin Wall had opened, and there were suddenly 300,000 people who had escaped through the barbed wire that had been snipped on Hungary's border. Right. They then came to West Germany, which is where I was living.
You founded your own faith-based group.
We did, actually. We didn't even name it, but we found that people heard about what we were doing. It really made it evident that if you just step out and say, "Here I am, Lord, send me," things happen. People would bring us clothes and pots and pans and blankets and checks and say, "Do you know any East German children who need help?" And we'd say, "Boy, do we ever." So it was really an opportunity to see, first of all, the joy of serving, and second of all, to see that the power of
is that right? And I did find it interesting, though, in writing about your Street Saints book, you had talked about how you saw a connection between the faith that motivated not only your own service, but just the ideals and the human spirit, and of course God's spirit, that gave these people courage to flee communism, and how you were seeing sparks of that in America's inner cities, which in many ways face a whole different set of problems that we wouldn't often associate with.
Consequences are going to be, but to just step out in courage, change the course of history in Eastern Europe and Russia, because they were willing to simply stand there as a single candle, right where God planted them, and speak the truth, and then reach out to people in love, even if it was dangerous. That same spirit has prompted people in our inner cities to stand up in dangerous neighborhoods, despite drug dealers, despite crime, despite really not being acknowledged by the rest of the people in the city.
What work are the Street Saints doing? And tell us, too, why you call them Street Saints.
Well, the quintessential street saint is Mother Teresa,
Absolutely.
Of course, who everyone knows, having been on the streets of Calcutta.
And quite literally a saint soon, I think.
Absolutely, and well-deserved. But she has counterparts, many of them lay people who are with the same kind of spirit, willing to go and bind up the wounds of those who are broken and battered. Maybe not physically, but in serving as a vessel of God's love, to lift people to their feet, to heal them, and to make their lives whole. They're all different kinds of people. They are black and white and Hispanic. Some of them are previous drug addicts who have left heroin and are now helping other people do the same. Some of them are former CEOs who have decided they've had success, now they want to have significance.
Right.
Very different kinds of people, but the thing that they have in common is a heart to
illness that now they're trying to help others get through. Is there something significant there about a significant connection between faith-based service and the wounded healer phenomenon? And you don't see that as much maybe in a secular setting. You tend to have more professional social workers who may have their own wounds, but it's not so much that sense of, I've literally been one
who had written a lot of very intelligent theological books.
Harvard professor.
Exactly, but in his later years was really running dry spiritually.
Yes.
And simply went to live out his last years in a community, L'Arche, in Toronto, with mentally handicapped people. And he said, essentially, it was as though God had said, go and live among the wounded to become healed yourself. To some extent, that is a common thread with the street saints here. There's one of them on their first date.
Interesting way to meet.
Interesting way to meet, yes. They have now founded a home here in San Antonio, and they have helped 13,000 other addicts leave their addiction with the help of God. They come through on the other side, but Freddie and Ninfa can look at them as they're going through the withdrawal and say, you can do this. We did it.
This is an issue very close to my heart because I was a speechwriter to President Bush and wrote a lot of his speeches on the faith-based initiative. So often as part of researching for the speeches, I would call up directors of some of these programs, including some of the ones you profiled, and follow a few rules in order to have this. Why is that important? It seems we've kind of lost that in some other social service programs.
Accountability is something that really helps establish boundaries. Sometimes people who are living in a desperate situation are there because of choices they've made. Others are not. Sometimes people may be called Interfaith Housing Coalition. He's recently retired. But he had a couple who came into him. The man had been caught doing drugs in this home, and one of the conditions was you can't do drugs while you're living here. They gave them shelter for 3 months and were trying to get people on their feet. Well, he confronted this man, and the man said, well, you know, I've got a drug problem. He said, fine, we'll help you get rid of that drug problem. So they sent him off to detox while his wife, who was pregnant, stayed there, had the baby. Her husband had gone to jail and stayed there. But she said, thank you for holding us accountable. I now knew that I needed to leave drugs too, and my life is now in order. Thank you for holding our feet to the fire.
And that shows the power of personal responsibility. It also, I think, relates a lot to the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. This is something that basically from outside, the resources maybe can come from outside, but there's a sense that you do have the power. There are things that you can do. And again, that principle of subsidiarity, I see in a lot of these faith-based groups, and I think we've lost sometimes in our very bureaucratic government programs at times. Would you agree?
Very much so. Subsidiarity says essentially that that smallest unit, that smallest civic unit that's capable of solving a problem, side cannot. And that's why we're seeing the fruits of these organizations that are doing so well.
We've got to go to a break right now, but when we come back with Barbara Elliott, we're going to talk more about faith-based groups, the separation of church and state, how that applies to this question, and also how you can get involved and find good groups to donate and volunteer with. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Colleen Campbell, and we're talking today with Barbara Elliott about faith-based groups. Barbara mentioning that, and there's been a lot of controversy. There's been an issue raised and batted around, of course, in all sorts of spheres of American public life, but particularly with this issue of, you know, is it really proper for the government to be giving support to a faith-based group? Now, Catholic Charities is our largest Catholic social service organization, been receiving government funds for various things for years. But there's a question of, should that be expanded, or is that
of government predicated upon the faith that would guide people from within, allowing them to live moral and virtuous lives. Our founders never intended that we eject faith from the public square. Quite the opposite. John Adams said our Constitution is only made for a moral and a religious people, and it will be inadequate to any other. So in that sense, the soul of America was always rooted in faith. The government form itself was never to inculcate faith, but it needed to look at the history of the country. Faith has always played a really central role in shaping the character. It also prompted our forefathers to look after one another in a very generous way. I mean, during the colonial period, it would be the most natural thing if somebody's barn burned down that the neighbors would go and rebuild it. Or if a child was left without parents, it would be natural for them to then be adopted by another family and taken in. That was the way Americans took care of each other. When Alexis de Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, he was amazing. People who just from the grassroots up look at a problem, look at their neighbors and say, we need to do something about this. And we very often have done so because of our faith. Now, an interesting thing happened about the 1960s.
The war on poverty.
Exactly. We shifted the responsibility to larger institutions, the government in many cases, but also to large civic institutions simply who lost the eye-to-eye contact, name-to-name contact. Ushered in the faith-based initiative was to recapture some of that American spirit of helping one another's neighbor, precisely to do what the government can't do, and that is to love.
Now, we certainly have seen there's kind of an inverse relationship, isn't there, between the more bureaucracy we have, the weaker our civil society gets. It becomes where, and I don't know, where the feds were. I don't really particularly care. Some folks said the federal government was good, it was the locals' fault. Some said it was the local government that did a good job, the feds didn't. But it was interesting that on this survey I saw, everyone came out saying, you know who helped me the most? It was my church. It was
1,000 people who were trained within the space of 3 days from the churches to go and work in the shelters. That was more people than had landed in the shelters up to that point.
Really?
And it was all spontaneous. People of faith simply stepped forward and said, where can I go help? And it was a very affirming thing for me to see that even without being summoned forth, it wasn't a big call across the city, people just stood up and did it, which affirmed for me that that spirit of service is in our faith community. And
in his most recent, his new encyclical had said, the work of the church is charity. We must always be giving Christ, but we don't want to give the message of Christ in such a way as to imply that if you don't do this, we're not going to feed you, we're not going to help you. How do faith-based groups avoid that? And I'm sure some of them fall into that trap, but come all,
It's really not the way it is. For the most part, people of faith offer a service simply out of the love in their hearts. Now, there's a spectrum of organizations. Some of them have been founded because of faith and have absolutely no faith content whatsoever. Some of them have what I call faith optional. You might offer a Bible study as a part of a welfare to work program, but nobody's required to go. There are, on the other end, however, some that are faiths. For the organizations that do receive any federal funding, they may not use federal dollars for religious materials, religious instruction. They must provide another option for people who don't want to be in that program to direct them elsewhere. And those have been the clear dividing lines. For the people who have faith content as a part of what they offer, that means that they are not a bit of a Faustian bargain in that, because if you're a faith-based organization for which the faith content is an important part of what you do. In other words, you believe that feeding the soul is at least as important as providing job skills. Then, if you apply for great amounts of federal money, you may end up having to sanitize those parts from your program.
And I think, at least in the Boston case, there's been some difficulty because Massachusetts allows that, and so there's, at least temporarily, and Boston Catholic Charities having to pull out of adoptions altogether, which is sad to see. But I think there is a real deep concern, even among people who love the work of faith-based groups, that once you start taking
some people are justifiably concerned that the federal dollar will tend to secularize the delivery of otherwise very good programs and services. The groups that are closest to the heartbeat of the folks that they serve are often the smallest, and those have been a lot of the ones that I have counseled and worked with.
The ones operating on a shoestring.
Exactly. A wing and a prayer and held together with duct tape. I have advocated that they not apply for federal funding for precisely that reason. What they do have public space, so it's not appropriate to evangelize or pray on the premises. However, by linking one adult to one child with one prayer partner behind the scenes, who never is going into that school, but whose job is to pray for that relationship. You have the power of prayer and the vehicle of love going and changing the lives of these children.
That seems to be a good solution
and
to that sort of problem.
It's a wonderful solution. It works for the children.
We're going to run out of time here, but I want to give our viewers a sense. You did write a book, Equipping the Saints, on good work and God's work.
The most important thing is to look at the leadership of the organization, look at whether or not they can define what they're doing in terms of producing results, look for integrity in what they do, and look to see if they are truly connected to the people that they serve in a relational way. If they are the vessels of God's love directly to people whose names they can name, they're more likely to have results. Anybody who's interested in finding out about how to give or about where to find,
think about it, and I hope you'll join us next time for another edition of Faith and Culture.